Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me. Whether you are watching live or watching the recording, I just want to thank you for watching. Today we're getting ready to talk about Bootstrap, so we got a lot to talk about today in terms of all of that. This is something that, I might normally spend a little while longer on in a regular full semester length class, just looking at Bootstrap and playing with Bootstrap. But not today, since we are doing this in a summer period, right? In a summer class, we basically have roughly 6 fewer weeks to do all the same things. So, for example, right, like under normal circumstances, I would do jQuery a lot more. We'd have 3 weeks or more of jQuery and at least 2 weeks of Bootstrap. And when we get to things like the browser developer tools, we might have 2 weeks of that. That's just sort of the way the cookie crumbles with the summer semester. I try to do as much as we can here in these live sessions. I know that does leave you all with having to kind of do more on your own. But, just looking at the group I have this summer, I know I have a very smart, very talented group here with me this summer. Every single one of you that I've seen, work out of already. You've all been doing a really great job, and, just wanted to take a minute to tell you all how much I appreciate it. Your Module 3 assignments, your jQuery assignments, are due today, this evening by 11:59 p.m. I know I've already seen some stuff from some of you where you've had questions and we've helped you out with some stuff. So, I know that stuff's looking great there. Make sure you're using your resources. It's okay if you kind of redo some of the stuff that we've done, either in class or in, that you've seen demonstrated in the module. It's okay to kind of redo that, because the big thing here is implementation, right? As we've kind of talked about with jQuery, it's more important to me that you're able to kind of see it, understand it, and work with it than it is that you could do like crazy things from scratch with it. If I wanted you to be able to do crazy things from scratch with it, we'd have a whole course with it instead of just doing 2 weeks in one random course. Like we talked about in the jQuery class a couple weeks ago. The big thing there is that you can just kind of understand it for when, if you have to, work on a site that utilizes it. But we're talking about Bootstrap today, and I think you all will like Bootstrap. Me personally, I think Bootstrap's pretty easy, and I hope you all do as well, or will as well, by the time we get done with it. Because really, when it comes to Bootstrap, we're primarily going to be focusing on the CSS framework. We're not going to use the JavaScript plugins that are involved with Bootstrap at all. We don't really need them, right? The CSS framework does basically everything that we need. And it's really, really easy because it's really just adding classes to existing HTML elements, and then it lets Bootstrap style it for us. And so, one of the things that we've talked about before, we talked about it previously when we talked about jQuery, is the idea that if we do stuff a lot, or if that, something's particularly difficult, since we're a programmer, one of the things that we want to do is we want to try to figure out a way to automate that or make our life easier by using some kind of library file. And that's what we're doing here, right? When we talk about Bootstrap, all Bootstrap really is just a CSS file that's already been generated with a bunch of predetermined stylings in it. And so you can use that as a tool to really quickly and easily make really good looking websites. And so we'll talk about Bootstrap just a little bit here. We'll swap over. I've got some really fun demonstration for us to do today, just kind of showing you the power of Bootstrap. It is super fun and super easy, and almost without fail, every single semester, students are like, this is really easy. I love using this. Can I use it more? Can I use it in other sites? And the answer to that is yeah, right? Like, I don't really, once we get out of Web 115, right? Like I like to call Web 115 kind of like our training wheels class, right? Once we get out of there and we're kind of more open to what we can do in the development world, in terms of what you use for tools and how you implement them, doesn't really bother me as much because it's more realistic, right? With the exception of, if that particular module is looking for a particular skill that we want to build. But for example, in the web design class that a lot of you will take in the fall, it doesn't really ask you to write any custom custom CSS. So if you wanted to use Bootstrap and just kind of did your best to make it, what you wanted to make it, that's perfectly acceptable, right? So, that's one of the big things that we're doing with this. So let's just start out by talking a little bit about Bootstrap, what it is, where it came from, all that sort of fun stuff, just so we have this sort of historical background with it. I kind of gave you a brief there of just what exactly Bootstrap is, but let's get some words on the screen here so we can have this committed to record. Bootstrap is a free front-end framework for faster and easier web development. Right? Somebody else has already done the work for us. And so as a result, we don't have to do the work ourselves. Especially people who are better programmers, who, work better with things like JavaScript and Python and PHP. They oftentimes find CSS very difficult, right? Because CSS operates under an entirely different set of rules than basically any other way that we're trained when we're learning how to program. Right? We talk about the cascading rules and how, things that we do later override things that we do earlier unless we do them we do them using some sort of higher specificity. And then we have pseudo selectors and pseudo classes and different kinds of DOM selectors and all this kind of stuff in CSS when we get into some more advanced CSS. And that just makes CSS hard. Right? It doesn't seem like there should be a good reason for CSS to be hard. And so that's why we end up with things like Bootstrap. You might have heard of something called Tailwind. Tailwind is along the same lines as Bootstrap. Bootstrap is still more widely used than Tailwind, I think, which is why I still do use Bootstrap in this course. But if you learn one, you can basically look at the documentation for the other and use the other one just as easy. It might be something that you want to kind of research. But primarily, Bootstrap is CSS, right? It's a CSS-based design template, and it handles all sorts of stuff, right? Typography, forms, buttons, tables, navigation, modals, image carousels, all sorts of stuff. Right, and there's an optional JavaScript library that is JavaScript plugins that comes with Bootstrap that you could use. We're not going to talk about those, right? It's primarily the CSS that we're doing. We're going to leave the JavaScript alone. If you want to kind of play with the JavaScript, you're welcome to try it out. But our focus is going to be on the CSS. It gives you the ability to create really easy, responsive, I think is the bigger thing here, responsive designs, which is super cool. And so Bootstrap actually started out, it wasn't always just called Bootstrap. Back when it was invented, or created, I should say, maybe not so much invented because it is just CSS, but it is what it is. But Bootstrap was developed by Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton at Twitter and released as an open source product in August of 2011 on GitHub, right? So Mark Otto and Jacob Thornton, they worked at Twitter, and basically what they were doing was they were trying to create a design system for Twitter. One of the things that we'll talk about in the fall in the web design class again are design systems and what they are and how we would use something like that. But they were trying to come up with a design system for Twitter, and so they came up with the idea of Bootstrap. Something that they could spin up quickly and easily that would give a uniform look and feel, a uniform design to everything they did. Well, when they open sourced it, it was initially called Twitter Bootstrap. But from there, it's kind of evolved and it's grown and it's changed in its 11-year history, nearly 11-year history. Last fall, when in this course, we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of Bootstrap. But it's easy to use, right? Absolutely anybody, if you have learned the absolute basics of CSS, right? The things that we cover in like Module 2 of the Web 115 course, right? So the most basic of the basic stuff. If you've learned that, you can use Bootstrap, right? So just based on the stuff that you learned in the, if you've never done any HTML or CSS before and you just went through the boot camp that we did at the start of the course, you have enough knowledge to use Bootstrap. Super cool. It's got responsiveness in it. Responsiveness is built in. We'll talk a little bit about the grid system that's built into Bootstrap. And when we talk about a grid system here, the grid system is different than CSS grid. This grid system that's in Bootstrap is actually built on Flexbox. But we'll talk more about that when we get to that point. We're in Bootstrap 5 now. Last time I taught this, it was still Bootstrap 4, and I forgot I still had Bootstrap 4 here in my notes. But it really doesn't matter, right? Because the vast majority of the things are still the same. There are a couple teeny tiny differences that we can use our documentation to refer to when we get to those points. We're just going to kind of go through, as we're doing our demonstrations, we're just going to kind of go through the Bootstrap documentation here as well. Because that's another one of the, I guess, sort of hidden things we learn in this class is to kind of use tool documentation. Right, because we use a very limited set of tools in this class when there are dozens and dozens and dozens of web tools out there that are similar to kind of the things that we learn. So just having this basic understanding of the most utilized ones and then being able to use the documentation or just to be able to Google and find answers to some of our other issues. Like this is just as big of a skill as anything else that we learn in here. So that's a thing. It's Bootstrap 5 now, though, but they uses a mobile-first framework, and that again is one of the big things that we talk about in the web design class is a mobile-first framework, designing for essentially mobile-first, to have it look good on mobile-first, because there is a statistic, something like somewhere around 80%, I think it's like 78% of all of the websites accessed every day are accessed through a mobile phone. And I mean, you can probably kind of think of, all the websites that you access on your phone versus what you access on a computer, right? Then there are some places where the only access to the internet that individuals have is through a mobile phone. And so when we think about design and we think about how the majority of people are going to interface with our site, designing with a mobile-first ideology is critical, right? We optimize for mobile, and then we kind of make it look nice on desktop as well. Browser compatibility works with every single modern browser. Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer, Safari, Opera. If you've seen and wondered what my strange browser is that I use here, I use the Opera browser. I know a lot of you have probably seen the browser in these live classes and are wondering like, hey, that doesn't look like Chrome or Firefox. And it is because I use Opera, and specifically Opera GX, which is their gaming sort of specific browser. It's got a lot of tools built into it. Speaking of gaming, by the way, just as an interesting aside, in the Shelby Star newspaper that came out in print on Tuesday and came out digitally yesterday, I talked about the college's esports program that we're working on, which I am heavily involved in. I'm quoted in the article. If you want more information about that, you can check out that article, or you can get in touch with me. We are super excited about what we're doing with esports and gaming here at the college to provide you all more opportunities. So back to it. Compatible with all modern browsers, mobile-first approach, responsive, easy to use. So if if you've listened to me say anything about web development at all, then you would know that this is a win, 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 win. Like, all of these are big wins. And so where can we get Bootstrap? Well, if I want to get Bootstrap, I'm going to go to getbootstrap.com. Just like last week when we were looking to get, or the last couple of weeks when we were looking to get jQuery, we'd go to jQuery.com. In order to get Bootstrap, I'm going to go to getbootstrap.com. And just like with jQuery, you can download the library files and host them yourself. But also, just like with jQuery, right? If you use a CDN version, if you use a version of Bootstrap on a CDN, then it's likely that your users are going to have that cached in their browser memory. Things are going to load a little bit faster. So there are a lot of benefits from using a CDN. So we're going to use a CDN, Content Delivery Network, for Bootstrap, just like we did for jQuery. So if we pop over to our browser window here, let me make sure I grab the right one. Here's our code window. That'll make it a little bit easier. This is getbootstrap.com. Let's make that big. This is getbootstrap.com. getbootstrap.com. Let's see if we can zoom in on that there. Boom, getbootstrap.com. And right here on the home page, if I just scroll down a little bit, I have the links to include via CDN. We can see that they use JS Deliver, which was one of the same CDNs that jQuery used to deliver the jQuery documentation, or the jQuery library files, I should say. And we see here we have the CDN for the CSS file, which is the first one here, and the one for the JavaScript file. We're not going to use the JavaScript file. We're just going to use the CSS file. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. Just highlight it and copy it there, and have it saved on my clipboard. But before I actually use it, I want to show you this. So this is the demo site that we're going to be using today. In order to save us some time, I just went ahead and built out a really simple, really basic site. We can see the code here. I can zoom in on it and talk about it for a few minutes. So we have our HTML skeleton boilerplate in here with our HTML tags, our head tags, our body tags, so on and so forth. We've already linked to a personal style.css page that we are using here. Right now it's empty. And we just have the same sort of standard HTML and CSS that we normally put in there. We have a header section, we have a main section, we have a footer section. In our header, we have an H1. In our main, we have a couple different sections that are just kind of like articles or just different sections of information here with a header and some paragraph information just to do some different stuff. For some of these paragraphs, we're going to play with using a grid on those as well. So we are going to, so I have them kind of sectioned out with some divs here. Remember, a div is a non-semantic version of a section tag. It's just a portion of our website that we're kind of just wrapping a container around so we can do more stuff with it. And so as of right now, just without any styling at all, right? We haven't brought Bootstrap into here yet. Our CSS file is empty. The site looks like this, right? This is the base live site for the site that we're working on here. But what I want you all to do is I want you all to pay close attention. I want you all to kind of remember what this looks like right now. Because just by including that CDN that I just copied and pasted, just by pasting that into my file and by saving it, it's automatically going to make a huge difference to what I've got going on, right? Because it's automatically going to pull that CSS file in. It's basically just like linking to the CSS files that we create, right? It's just linking to a CSS file that somebody else created for us. So just on the nature of just taking and pasting this in here, I'm going to paste it in the head section above the link to my CSS file that I'm creating here. I'm just going to paste it in there like that and save my file. And all of a sudden, huge differences, right? Not only is this a sans serif font, but this is a custom sans serif font, right? Like if we view and we inspect element, we can see a lot of the stuff that's going on here. Let's get that to come up there. We can see by default it sets us, let's zoom in down here. By default it does you know, a lot of the same resets that we do, right? Like here's box sizing border box on asterisk selector, just like we've been doing the past, you know, lots of times that we've been making fonts or making websites. We see that there are a lot of variables that are set into place here for font family. And once we click that, we can see what that variable is. And it's actually a system UI font. So it's going to use Roboto, Helvetica New, basically just whichever one of these your system kind of defaults to. In the fall, in Web 2.15, we'll talk a little bit about CSS variables and things like that. They take big advantage of CSS variables here for setting colors, right? Like we see these colors here are set as variables with variable names. So instead of referring to 0D, 6E, FD, we would refer to the variable --BS blue, and so on and so forth. But there are also other names and stuff for that we'll see as we get in there. And basically the heavy usage of these variables really is kind of what makes this simple to a degree, right? Like, you know, using a lot of variables gives a name to something complex. It can give a name. They also use Sass on the back end to do several things, which we actually play with Sass in a future module, so you'll see a little bit more of the back end of how that works there. Right, but just by the nature of me pasting in that link to Bootstrap, you see these big changes here. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to just kind of go through the documentation, the Bootstrap documentation, and just show you some different stuff that we can do with our site as we go through the documentation. And so we get to the documentation just by clicking Docs here at the top of our page on getbootstrap.com. And it gives us some quick start material here. So if you don't remember any of this stuff that I'm talking about, you can go here to this quick start material and it gives you all the CDN links. It shows you where to put them. talks about next steps. It even talks about the JavaScript components and all the JavaScript things there as well. Since it is mobile first and responsive, having this meta viewport is important in there. However, that is also put in by default if you use your exclamation point expansion in Visual Studio Code with Emmet, right, that we've done for the past several weeks. Just to that's it. That's in there by default, so you don't have to worry about making sure that's in there. It also talks about for cross-browser rendering, they use Reboot, which is another tool. And it's basically just a file in there that just kind of helps cross-browser issues. Because remember, CSS is rendered by your browser. So, when you're thinking about, since it's rendered by your browser, browsers render CSS in a slightly different way. However, that's just telling you that they've taken some steps here to do their best to ensure that this renders exactly the same in every single browser. Right, and so when we get down to here, we see a lot of the stuff that we can do with this, right? Like we see some customization here. And in this customization, what this is primarily talking about is you being able to customize Bootstrap yourself. So it tells you about structuring the Sass and what to do with that, and structuring, different options and things of that nature. Working with different variables and things of that nature. So since we're just going to use the baseline Bootstrap just right out of the box, you don't have to worry about that section. Layout, that's where we're going to have to start worrying about things and start actually getting some of the stuff from here into our site. Right, so really what we've done already, like all this getting started stuff is just informational. You can read that if you'd like to get some more information about everything. It talks about accessibility. It talks about, various tools that they use, how it works on different browsers, so on and so forth. Customizations if you're, hosting it yourself on a server that can, deal with the Sass and deal with rendering all this other stuff on the back end. We're not worrying about that, so we can skip that. So let's go to layouts. And the first thing that we have here are breakpoints. And so our breakpoints have to do with responsiveness, right? We talked about how responsive. We talked about, well, let me take a step back before I get into that. We talked about, how Bootstrap makes our CSS responsive just by default. Right, and so we have these breakpoints, which are customizable widths that determine how our responsive layout behaves across devices. Right, and so we can see these different breakpoints here. And these breakpoints are broken, something that we'll talk about in Web 2.15 in the fall. We talk about media queries. You can probably see how, normally running this class in the fall and how these things are side by side with one another. A lot more stuff in context. However, you'll have a leg up going into the fall then. Well, we have these different breakpoints. Extra small, small, medium, large, extra, extra large. And so each breakpoint was chosen, and when we say that each breakpoint here, we're talking about the dimensions that it was chosen for, to hold multiples of 12. So if you'll look here in the dimensions column, we'll see these 6 numbers. Each of these 6 numbers is evenly divisible by 12. 576, 768, 992, 1200, 1400. Each of these numbers evenly divisible by 12. And that's because of the grid system that Bootstrap uses. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. Not only is this, not only are they divisible by 12, but they're also kind of, they kind of fall in line with different devices. You know, they're not going to get you every single device, but they're going to get you in a range. And we'll see these different breakpoints used in various things throughout utilizing jQuery. Not jQuery, Bootstrap. jQuery was last week. Throughout using Bootstrap. And the first thing is containers. Right, so we have all these containers that we can utilize here. Container fluid is a container that I like to use a lot, and that just means it's fully responsive. And then you can see all the other containers here and where they're at. Container, which is container extra small, container medium, container large, container extra large, container extra extra large. And it just shows you where the breakpoints are. So if I use .container on a 1080p screen, that's 1920 by 1080, then that container is going to be 1,320 pixels wide. And as I shrink that window down, it's going to get smaller. So let's have a look at that in action, right? And let's just put... I'm going to change this in just a minute, but I want you to be able to kind of visualize this. So let's look at our demo here. Right now we see, right, like everything here's full width on this container. So if I go into my main section here, if I go into my main tag, that's the wrong key. I meant to hit 4 instead of 3. And you might have noticed when I was looking at the documentation there that everything started with a period. And one of the things that we said before when we're working with periods, when we're in our CSS file, when we're in our jQuery, a period means a class, right? So I'm just going to add a class of container to this main. And that's all I need to do. And everything else is done for me. So now we'll see that by default, right, it created my container here. Since I just used the class of container, that defaults to the extra small container. So that means that at 1080p width here, this container is 1,320 pixels wide. And we can actually see that if we go in here and we use our inspect element tool. And we look at the width of our main. We can see right here, main, max width, 1,320 pixels. And we can also see here that it's centered it for us, so we don't have to worry about, remembering our margin trick, right? Everything's all nice and neat in there. Another option is to use a responsive header to where it'll always be 100% regardless of how wide your browser is, right? Like if we take and we shrink this browser down, we'll see that once our browser hits our different breakpoints in width, then it jumps in a little bit, right? That's the result of the media query. So it gives us that responsive nature and reflows our text for us. However, there's also a responsive container, which is our container fluid, and that's going to be full width regardless of the size of the viewport. So in this case, right, like I might in my header make that a class of container dash fluid. And so you can't really see it here, right? Because it's just determined by the width of the, it's just determining the width of the item, right? But it is a full width item that is a container. And that's really how we use containers in a nutshell. Next is grid here, and I want to circle back to grid in just a little bit. So we'll go down here to content, and we'll look at typography. And so typography shows us different type settings. We see we have specifically set heading levels here for H1, H2, H3, H4, and H5. These are all created from within Bootstrap. If we want to customize our heading, there are some options that we can use to customize our heading. You can kind of see some of those here. Being able to convert them to a display heading is something that I like to do a lot. So if I want to say take my welcome to our website here and convert it to a display 1, it's not going to change the heading level, right? It's still heading level 1. It's just going to change how it looks. So I'm just going to go into that H1 there. And I'm going to add a class equals display-1. And that's going to change the font. That's going to change the font weight, the font size. There it is. Quick, easy, right? I mean, you could see, like, we've only done 3 things here, right? Like, we set 2 container widths and made this a display, and it already looks crazy in terms of what the default is. Like, way better. If we keep going here, we can actually see font sizes. There are different font sizes and things that we can apply here. We see how we can apply different text elements in line and how those look, right? They've slightly changed the highlight color, for example. By default, it's a brighter yellow, and then here it's a more muted sort of yellow-orange. And we see we just use our standard HTML for that. If we want to center text, if we want to do some things with that here, we do have classes for that as well. So if we want to center our text, we have a class of text-center. If we use... I accidentally clicked there. I'm looking at the block quotes. We can use a class called block quote to create a block quote. So if you've ever thought about oh, I want to make a pull quote in my page, I can use this code here as a template, put it in my page, make a pull quote out of it, and end up with something that looks like this, or this, or this. Lists have a bit of a special styling to them. As do description lists. And it talks about the SAS there. Now, one of the things that I should point out here is that since this is just an additional CSS file, that's just a part of our project, we can make changes ourselves, right? So like if I wanted my font to be bigger in my paragraphs, I could still go into my style.css file, focus my paragraph element, add a font -size, and make it a lot bigger, like make it like 2 rem or something like that. And then we get something really big. 2 rem is too big. Right? Ideally, we'd probably want that to be more like 1.2 rem. That's more reasonable, right? So just because we have this prescribed set of tools for us, it doesn't mean that it's the only thing that we can use, right? We can supplement it with our own CSS, right? So for example, if I wanted to add some height to this header, I can do that. I can focus my header element. I can set a height on it of 250 pixels or whatever I wanted to do. And all of a sudden I have some height here. Now I'm going to apply color using Bootstrap, but this gives you an idea here. Another thing that we could do here is I believe it is B for bold. So I think if I wanted to add bold here, I can just add a space and add B in there. I think is what I want for bold. Might not be. Let's inspect element. I mean, it's right here in my, like if I just look here in my my list here, I can figure it out. Looks like I could just include a strong tag in here, which is probably what we would want to do. I believe a B class is something that was taken out of 5, but I could just add a strong set of strong tags around the title here to make it bold, and it would work for me, like so, right? Bolder. So let's talk about color a little bit. We'll, just kind of do sort of the basic stuff here. Everything that you see is a class, so you're just going to be adding classes to elements to make them, what you want them to be. Where is color? There it is in utilities. So we have a lot of colors here. We have text primary, text secondary, text success. These are all for text colors. And then for background colors, you use the same names: primary, secondary, success, danger, all of these variables, blue, indigo, teal, but you use BG for these instead of text, right? So if I wanted my clicking the wrong thing. For example, if I wanted my H2s to be that text, that primary blue text color, I can go to those H2s. I can add a class of text-primary and just do that to both of my H2s. And that's going to make those nice and blue. And if I wanted to take my header here, I can add a class of BG-primary and save that. Right, remember you add more than one class to an element just by separating them with spaces. And so then when I come back here, that's nice and blue. White. Is there a class white? No. I can just make the H1 white in my CSS. Color white. And we end up with this. Right? So you see we didn't do much work here, right? We did hardly any work at all. And we've got something pretty interesting. Some things that we might want here is we might want a little margin. Going off of that, we do have some classes for that. We see here there's a spacing in our utilities. If we look at that, we can see that M is for margin, P is for padding. You have the sides here, top, bottom, so on and so forth, and the amount of margin or the amount of spacing that you want to add. So if I wanted to add some bottom margin to the header, I would add MB and some amount of margin. So let's try MB-2. To our header here, we will add a class of MB-2. And that should add some bottom margin to our site. That's right. That is correct. Let's make it MB-6 just to make sure it's bigger. Because we might be running into issues with border collapse here. That is the correct code. Could be the container that's causing that. Let's add MT-6 here. And do that instead. Really, we wouldn't want to do this. We'd rather do padding top here, wouldn't we? So we wouldn't have that separation. We'd rather do padding top there. As our that's correct, and I'm not sure why it's working. I don't know why it's not working. I'm not entirely sure if maybe my live server is broken here. In the slowness of my computer. But that's not working right. Let's check our inspect element here. See, it's there. But it is not adding the padding. Did I make a little typo here? Class container PT6. Let's add it here on the section and see if it just doesn't like containers, which is possible. Class equals PT-6. And that's supposed to be -6. Huh. That certainly is interesting. Because that should be working. Oh well. Not sure why it isn't. Could be my device being slow. Let's talk about grid before we go today. You all can kind of go through the material in the module and go through the documentation here and see everything that this has to offer. We see kind of the, some of the big stuff here. Right, let's go through grid here really quickly so we can just kind of go ahead and wrap up for today. Let me pull up another slide presentation here just so we can talk about grid for a minute before we do it. So with the grid system, Bootstrap's grid system is built on a series of containers, rows, and columns. Right? So to lay out and align content, it's built with Flexbox and it is fully responsive. It is a simpler alternative to traditional box model positioning, although it is a little bit complex. As we kind of mentioned previously, everything's divided into a 12-column grid system. So in a singular row, which when we're thinking about things with Bootstrap, we want to think about things in terms of rows. We need to make sure that all of the columns in a particular row add up to 12. Right? So if I have 2 columns that I want to be equal width in a document, I can make it col -6 and col -6 in a singular row. And then they will also flex and respond accordingly. Right, so for example, if we look at our Bootstrap demo here, I have our main class of container. I can make this container itself a row. And then it's going to look at the children of that container. So if we took this and we kind of drew out the DOM here, right, we would have our main. Then inside of that main, we have 2 sections. Then inside of those sections, we have like an H2 and a paragraph and another div. And then inside of that div, we have 2 more paragraphs. And both of them are the same. H2, paragraph, div, paragraph, paragraph. So if we kind of drew this out, it would look like this. Really sloppy drawing here. But not too bad, pretty simple. So if we say main is a row, then it's going to impact its direct children. So that would be these 2 sections. So if I said main itself was a row, that's going to define it as a row. So then I have to make sure that those 2 sections have column amounts in them that add up to 12. So one will be col -6, and the other will be class equals col -6. So now they're both 6-column width items on our demonstration. Now you do see that did impact our container. Right? It took it and it changed where it was located. It's going to do that. We could try to add mx-auto here, which is basically the rough equivalent of our margin auto trick. But since it hasn't really been liking margins at all for whatever reason, that's fine. Ideally here, I put that in the wrong one. Let's change that in. Put it into our main class here. Put it in there with mx-auto. See if that works to center it back up, which it should, but yep, there we go. So we have two things that are, 6 column widths. They're equal column widths. If we resize our window here, they're going to adjust on the breakpoints accordingly, so we always have 2 columns. If I wanted to, I could make one wider than the other, just so long as they always added up to 6. So I could take this first one, for example, add 2 to it to make it 8. Take the second one here, take 2 away from it, make it 4. And then the second column is going to be narrower than the first column. We could even make subgrids here, which is one of the things that I wanted to do. So like if I wanted to take these 2 paragraphs that are in this section, make them into their own sort of sub grid, I can find the parent to those 2 paragraphs, which is this div here. Add the class of row to it, and then put column data in these paragraphs. Class equals call -6, and make them add up to 12. Class equals call -6. Save that. And now we have a little subgrid here as well. Right? So we're just gridding things up. So whatever you want to grid up, you put it in a column. Or you put it in a row, and then you make the different elements that you want to be a part of that row into different column sizes, and your column sizes have to add up to 12, right? Because we have that, every breakpoint is evenly divisible by 12 thing that we talked about previously. Right, so as you can see, there's a lot of stuff here, but it all basically works kind of the same, right? Like I can look through this documentation guide here. I can say, okay, well, let's see, what do I want to do here? I want to make, I've got some borders that I want to deal with here. So let's look at borders. And there's that information on the background colors that we got earlier. BG light, BG white. So it's probably, instead of, we could probably get rid of H1 color white here and add in to our H1 text dash white. And yeah, that works. Well, let's make sure that's saved, so we make sure that works. Yeah, it works. We also have these gradients here, which are pretty cool, right? If I wanted to do a little gradient, I could say, I could take this and I could put it on the body, right? So I could take the body, I could add a class to the body. Class equals, throw that right in there. Right, that's going to put, or that should put, the background on the body there. Oh, it's because of the periods. Those periods aren't supposed to be in there. Those periods are supposed to be out, and they're supposed to be replaced by either a space or nothing. There we go. Now we have that, and we have a gradient there that you can see. It's going from a lighter blue to a darker blue, and we could take that main, and we could put a background white on it, right? BG white on main. Or BG light if we if we didn't want it to be, pure white. Got our footer down here at the bottom that we need to address. Maybe we can make that footer the same, the BG primary. Right, footer class equals BG dash primary. And I would actually have to give that footer a bit of a height here. So Let's add a little bit of footer height here. Footer height is 250 pixels, or let's say it's 150 pixels. Now we have a footer here at the bottom. Really cool stuff, right? And we really haven't done a whole bunch of work here, I think is an important thing to point out. You know, we have, you know, the big thing here to come out of this is just me encouraging you to take time with this documentation. If you see a period, that means it's a class. So, you know, this would be class BG info plus adding the class of BG gradient. Gives you that sort of gradient background and all this sort of fun stuff, right? Just look through all of this, see what you want to do. And you can just add it in as classes. You add everything in, either as HTML elements or classes in the basic stuff. And with minimal effort, right? Like we didn't, you know, we just added a handful of classes here, and we got something that would take us a really long time if we were to try to do all of this manually, especially when we get into stuff like this here and making it responsive and all that sort of stuff in regular CSS. And we can supplement the things that we do with our own CSS to make it even more custom, to make it look more like what we'd want it to look like, right? Like we don't have to use these colors. We can use our own colors. We can, you know, that we define in CSS and all that sort of fun stuff. So this is, you know, just something that's fun for you all to kind of try out and work with and play with. And I encourage you all to do that, right? You know, just start out by making a simple site and working with it there. And from there, you know, you can kind of play with it and get more and more complex. Use the documentation. It's super simple. You're just adding classes into your HTML and it's doing things for you. And you can go through and you can see all of the different things that you have options for. A lot of the stuff that's here in the components are some of the JavaScript plugin things, which you probably don't want to deal with. I'm not requiring you to deal with any of that. Like the modal here is a JavaScript-based modal. Like all this stuff is modal or is JavaScript-based. Some of it's not. You know, you kind of just want to just kind of scroll through it, read the stuff. Right? Like it gives you this template here for this card that you could use. That's basically just a little bit of code. Like if I just wanted to copy that, add it into my site. Say I wanted to add it into this second, you know, this second paragraph here or whatever, I can just paste it in there. Customize that code with whatever text I want it to have in it. And then, you know, we have the card title there. There's no image there because I don't have this image saved in my project or whatever, but you get the picture, right? Like there should be an image here at the top, but there's not because there's no image there. I haven't saved any image for that. But that's something that you can kind of copy and paste and put in there. So simple, quick, easy, something that's fun to play with. I encourage you all to do that, right? Just play, just tinker. You know, this is one of the times where, you know, if we were in class, what I would do is I would just give you an unstyled site and just say tinker, make it look what you want, like what you want it to look like. So I'm going to encourage you all to do that. I'm going to put this on GitHub to share it with you. We'll do that off stream today. So that's all that I have for you for today. We'll put the music back on, play the music for a little bit, just in case anybody who's here with me live has any questions. If you're watching this later and you have questions, please feel free to let me know. Don't forget your jQuery assignments are due tonight by midnight. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.